My name is Nick Donahue. I'm the Deputy Secretary of Transportation, and I serve as the Chair of the Transportation Public-Private Partnership Advisory Committee. Really appreciate everyone coming out this afternoon for our meeting. This is a workshop meeting of this committee. There is no action that will be taken today. We are holding this meeting to follow up on the Secretary's commitment to increase transparency and accountability in Virginia's PPTA process. If you recall, when we last met in December of 2015, the Secretary said, when we get to the end of this procurement, I will come back and brief the members of this committee with additional information to let them know the things that the administration was able to see while we were in the middle of this procurement, so you can better understand the decisions that we made and the things that we saw to help us make those decisions. We have two items on the agenda. The first is Secretary Lane giving an overview of the process used to develop this procurement, and then they will be followed by Commissioner Kilpatrick, who will walk through some of the specifics of this project and the deal. And so with that, I'd like to welcome Secretary Lane to brief the committee.
Okay, and I like saying this. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, on that. So, members of the committee, thank you for having me here today. As you know, Governor McAuliffe just a few minutes ago announced the awarding of this contract, and what I'd like to do is to take you through where we were, how we got to this process, and the result that we got to today. Let me first start by the philosophy that Governor McAuliffe talked about at the press conference. Number one, we were there to protect taxpayers. We felt like the P3, or public-private partnership, should only be used when it's in the best interest of the public. I remind people the P3 laws were put in place to enhance the public contribution, not a default for the private sector. Many of you may recall my first job out of college. I worked for a gentleman named Walter Stosh. And I'm a CPA by background, and Walter was the senator who wrote the legislation for P3. So as we went through these reforms, I certainly spoke a lot with him about what he intended when he wrote this law. We also wanted to deliver a project that best needs that of the public. Some of the projects we had in the past were good projects, but it wasn't what we set out to do. So we wanted to make sure that we met that need. A lot of that is paramount to under our new SMART scale, that we're solving solutions, not just building projects because we can. As a testament to that, in terms of what Nick said to begin, the chairman, we want to be transparent and accountable to the public and to elected officials. And today I'm fulfilling one of those obligations to you by coming here and briefing you on how we got to where we are. And finally, we wanted to embrace the P3 reforms of House Bill 1886, which this particular procurement was procured under. Now, just to talk a little bit about those, the McAuliffe administration philosophy in terms of protecting taxpayers. As I mentioned, we reformed the P3 process. And I'll go through this. We believe we were able to save over $2.5 billion from where this procurement was when we first came into office. In terms of the P3 is only used in terms of the best public interest. We developed a public option and created competition within the private sector so that we could make sure that we were negotiating from a point which we understood. And having that public option, I also want to thank Secretary Rick Brown, who helped us work through that to make that a reality in terms of if we could not do it any cheaper than the public could on its own, then we would not entertain bringing in private parties. We wanted to project the best needs of the public, and in this particular project, it provides travel choices, congestion relief, and improved reliability. And in addition to what we contemplated in the project, it's created $500 million in additional funding from the private sector to address transportation needs in the corridor. This is over and above what we could have done ourselves. We could get to zero, but we could never write ourselves a check. So we have truly enhanced additional monies that were not at our disposal before this procurement. In terms of being transparent and accountable, we tried to do that by establishing an open and accountable process. I'll go through that. We published our contract, our term sheet, right up front. That's what we negotiated from. We didn't start from some nebulous point. We knew where we were to begin negotiations. And of course, we embraced the House Bill 1886, and a big part of that is the major business terms of the project, of the procurement, right up front and published on the website for everybody to see, which means if we were to change those, I would either have to start the procurement over or come to you and ask your permission to do so. Now, how do we get there? Well, in this particular project, we identified some flaws in the original P3 process. We went back and analyzed all the other P3 projects we've done, and we found that many times we were not putting Virginia taxpayers first. I'm not saying that was intentional. I'm just saying the results were that they were not first, and we needed to make sure that was the case. So we need to develop a new philosophy and a process for P3s. And in government, I'm from the private sector, but in government, I've found that process is very important, because process can sometimes eliminate risk or make sure you're being careful of the taxpayers' money. We established the cost for the state to build the project without private sector investment up front. We developed what we thought was needed in the project. So again, we had a baseline to begin our negotiations. And from that point is when we challenged the private sector to compete against the state-funded public option. And quite frankly, they responded magnificently, as we'll go through and see. Now, in terms of the flaws in the original P3 process, the governor mentioned this in his announcement, and I know Scott Casper's a CTB member. He and I discussed this one day in my office. Under the old process, we did what was called a value for money analysis, which basically was a listing of various perceived risks and somehow assigning a value to them. And under that analysis, as the governor mentioned, in this procurement on this project, the analysis showed that there was $900 million to $1 billion that was needed in public funding to build the project. It did not include any money for transit. It did not include any money for additional corridor improvements. It did not, therefore, deliver the full project benefits that we thought that were needed in the corridor. So that was one issue we thought. The way it was done before, the way the form was lined up, it started with the assumption that the P3 procurement was the right answer. It basically said, here's what the private sector can do it for. Oh, by the way, they must be more efficient than the public sector, and therefore, we're going to use a discount to say how much the public sector saved. I cannot tell you how they developed that. I understand it was thought through, and I'm not trying to say it was unuseful, but in true market conditions, always have to start from a base on what you believe it's going to cost you. It also assumed the risk in every P3 project were the same. And I would submit to you they are not. For instance, one of the ones we looked at was the construction of a tunnel under the Elizabeth River. The other one we looked at was adding lanes on an expressway. And both constructions were discounted at 25%. Now, I don't know which one was right, but I can assure you both were not 25%. And yes, that's the way we were doing it. It was because, oh, that's what we normally use. So a question whether or not that was the appropriate way to evaluate risk. And I thought was certainly a fatal failure was to explore the public financing options. Now let me point that out, one thing there. People said, well, we don't have any money. That is untrue. We always have money in the ability to issue debt. We may not want to issue debt. There might be a type of debt that would cost to go against our credit rating or our debt capacity, but there are other debts that don't do that. So even though we may not choose to do it, we always have the ability to fund those projects. And I would submit, if the state of Virginia, with its credit rating and our transportation bonds are AA+, by the way, the highest in our history. We just were on Wall Street, John Lawson and I and the commissioner on law, first time in our history, all three rating agencies rated our transportation debt AA+, and they referenced the reforms we've done in transportation in Virginia. So I would submit to you that we always have the ability to publicly finance these projects. Now, when we got to the specifics of this value for money analysis, it said that the toll revenues might be off by as much as 25%, and that could be as much as $828 million in net present value risk to the Commonwealth. However, when you looked at the analysis, though, there were 20% of the revenues that were unused during the term of the project. Well, if they're unused, why wouldn't they accrue to our benefit? So that, to me, seemed to be a flaw in this assumption. It also said that the assumption that politics would interfere with the maintenance of state of good repair of a toll facility, although state law requires that the first use of tolling revenue is to maintain the facility. And I would submit to you, VDOT could spend that money just as easily as the private sector in terms of maintaining that facility. So I did not believe that was an appropriate risk to discount. So with those flaws, we determined how we would move forward. How do we ensure P3 deals are consistent with the administration's policy? What are we trying to accomplish? How much does it cost? What are the revenues? And what are the inherent risks in the project? Coming from the business background, this seemed to be pretty basic to me in terms of understanding if I was going to invest or if I was going to put my own money up. So that's how the philosophy determining how we would move forward. Now, as we went through this analysis, we determined that, quite frankly, we could do it a lot less than the original value for money analysis. As you recall, the Governor mentioned it was going to be $900 to $1 billion in cost. This was back in February of 2014. We've just come in office. There was no support for transit, and there were no future quarter improvement funds. And we went through an analysis where we said, no, we believe we could finance this publicly between $400 and $600 million in upfront monies. We could support transit. We thought there was as much as $800 million in net present value over a 50-year term. And we thought there was somewhere between $200 and $500 million for future investment in the corridor at net present value. Part of this is we went through and did an investment-grade traffic and revenue analysis. John Lawson was very involved in that and working through these assumptions. Now, as you recall, that was not very well met with many people in the community. They thought we were making these numbers up. They thought that we didn't know what we were doing, and why would we want to change? Now, at the time, I told you, I just didn't rely on VDOT. We went out and we solicited 13 different ways to look at this project to verify these costs. But at the time, I said, I'm not going to tell you what they are because I felt that would inhibit our ability to negotiate in developing our terms. But I said I would do that when we picked a preferred bidder. So today, I'm disclosing to you, let's see, I back up there? Let's see here. One more after this, I guess. I will disclose to you what those numbers were and what the teams told us. We believe we needed to offer the private sector an opportunity to compete against this state public financed option. But we also said we were never going to take that off the table until we go to financial close. And that remains today. We keep that on the table until the check's in the bank. Janet, you hear that? The check will be in the bank where it comes off the table. So that will be our policy in moving forward. Even though I have all full confidence that we're going to close, we can never take that off. We never count that money until it's in the bank. So we issued this RFQ to help us determine how to come up with these parameters. And we looked at different things, a design build, ATC is alternative technical concepts, where we reach out to the private sector and ask them different questions about things that we may not know about. A design, build, operate, maintain a DBOM with public financing, where we would let everybody, they build it, they maintain it, they operate it, but we would finance it for them, or to a total concession. And here are those results, and I'll post on the website the actual quotes, but here's a summary of what we received, the ranges we received from these 13 different people who quoted us. And by the way, just so you know, this panel was privy to all that, and we let them before we went out. We just didn't make it public. They signed disclosure agreements, and therefore I wanted to make sure the public understands we sought other people's opinion, not just our own. And you can see quite clearly, at least one of, and it was actually more than that, of the teams said, we believe there's additional monies in the quarter, and actually it would generate monies coming back to the Commonwealth. That is the concession line. And so that we knew, we had verified what VDOT had done, and we verified with the private sector that there was a reward for taking this risk. And that is why we determined that we would go forward and ask this committee to approve, in the best interest of the taxpayers, a P3 concession. Now, we didn't pick the absolute best quote we got. As you can see, the best quote we got said we would actually get a check back, and we'd only need $148 million of upfront public funding. We chose $600 million because we wanted to be reasonable. And these, by the way, didn't include future corridor improvements of $350 million plus additional revenues. So we didn't go out there and say, okay, we got this one great thing, let's compete against that. We wanted to be a reasonable competitive advantage for the teams to execute from. So, based on these responses, the administration moved forward with the toll concession P3 procurement. A final RFP was issued on the deal in July 29th of 2016, and at that time, 3 teams expressed an interest in this concession. Transurban Skanska, Centra, Meridian Ferrovial, and a third team, Fluor, also expressed interest. They began the procurement, but during it, they were also awarded the Purple Line in D.C. or Maryland, and they informed us, I can't say that was exactly the reason they did, but shortly after that, they informed us that they would not be submitting a proposal. But 2 teams did submit compliant bids. Now, it's important to you to understand how we went about evaluating these bids. We divided it down between the cost and the technical factors. We had each team give us 2 envelopes. Now, I say envelopes, they are actually 2 big boxes of their technical scores or their technical parameters and their financial parameters. And recall, what we were balancing the technical against was our term sheet that we put right up front in this procurement. So our contract has been out there, and that's what they bid off of from the very beginning. So as far as negotiating, we did not negotiate. That was the terms to be a compliant bid. Now, our team, Northern Virginia, Nick Donahue was a part, others were part, John Lawson, other people from VDOT were a part of the team, scored that. And by the way, I should mention, the financial documents were given to a third-party attorney, not in the access of VDOT, so nobody that was scoring this knew what the financial scores would be until after the technical score. And you can see that was 30% of the score where we looked at customer service and these handback conditions, meaning what was the road going to look like in 50 years, the structure of the road, the durability, tolling, the partnership agreements, public outreach. You see the members of the team, two of my deputies were involved in that, the chief engineer, the deputy commissioner, people from VDOT, other teams. We've been to Texas. We have been to Toronto. We have been to North Carolina. I have personally talked with people who negotiated on behalf of public entities against both teams. We researched probably more so than any other P3 we had done in the past. And let me point out here, you have a question?
Yes. Mr. Chairman, if I could ask a question to the Secretary.
Yeah, I meant to make you break me any time, stop me any time.
So let me ask you, I was in the newspaper, I guess, recently with some problems in other states.
Yes.
So, and I know, all the various players in here at one time or another have been involved in P3 projects either in Virginia or other states. But it was highlighted that, some of the problems in some of those states. Was there a due diligence that took place?
Absolutely. In fact, none of that was reported in the paper. We were not aware of. Many of that was very old, and we were very much aware of that. And there was the specific questions we asked in talking with the negotiators. And in fact, in that particular case for that team, all said they were very, very comfortable with the performance of the team. And I've got a slide that goes through all of that. And you made a good point. That is that both teams at various times have missed projections or have had some type of restructuring or default, either in Virginia or outside of around the world. So if that was going to be as a precluding issue, then neither team would have been able to compete. Both teams remained in good standing in our due diligence in going through that. But one thing I also want to point out here, very important, our previous P3 contracts did not have performance for things like customer service and tolling operations. We put a language in there such that it said good business practices. And as you can tell, we've had some issues down in Hampton Roads with those good business practices. So what we did on these teams is we basically said, give us your operations manual. How do you do this? By the way, we were both very satisfied with both teams' performance in this area. But we said that's going to be part of the contract. So if you're not in conformity with your operations manual, then you've broken the contract. And because it's very important, these are 50-year partnerships. These are not a one-time transaction. And therefore, we need to make sure we're getting good service for the 50 years. Unfortunately, we haven't achieved that in one of our projects down in Hampton Roads as of yet. But we have done, to your specific question, significant due diligence on both teams.
And there's, I guess, provisions are in the contract or in the proposal that if at any point they were to walk, is there a process that takes place?
Yeah, so as we go through this, I'll go through it, but quite frankly, there will be on the construction risk a performance bond. Both teams had to submit graded by the rating agencies proposals. Both received acceptable proposals that they could perform. And in the particular winning team, we have a check up front. And that is key because if we were willing to build it ourselves for $600 million, I don't wish any ill to anybody, don't get me wrong. But I think we're in a much better position regardless of the outcome because it's the same debt, the same tolling, and the equity that we were put on, we now have a check. But I'll be happy to go through that and explain that as we go through this detail in that. I think it's very important, and I want to make sure before I signed off and the commissioner would sign off that this is in the best public interest. I can assure you that was a question on my mind. Now, here are the results of the procurement. You've seen the first two before, where we began this, where our term sheet was, and what the winning bid. Now, I should point out, both teams were compliant. The winning team of Centrum, Iridium, and Ferrovial gave us a check for $500 million, or will give us at closing. The other team required a public subsidy. Now, I'm not going to reveal that public subsidy until we get to closing, financial close. They're a good partner of ours, and quite frankly, until we actually have the money in the bank, I want to keep all options on the table with us in terms of moving forward. It doesn't necessarily mean we'd go back. We also have the option to do it ourselves, but I don't think it's appropriate to disclose. But you can see that's somewhere between $0 and $600 million, and then versus a $500 million cash up front. So it's somewhere between $500 million and $1.1 billion is the difference in the two proposals from financial in that. Now, this is to your point. We went back and looked at all of the past three deals, and this is not to be pejorative or unkind to anyone. It's the facts of what Virginia's experience are of the P3 deals, and it's right to your point because both teams have had projection issues. Both teams have had issues in paying debt, either in Virginia or without. On the Pocahontas Parkway, we had the first one we did, the projections were not made, and it had to be handed over to the senior lenders. But we did not preclude that team from bidding in the future. The same thing on the 495 express lanes. That had to be restructured. They didn't make their numbers, but we didn't preclude them because they missed their performance in the future. The downtown Midtown Tunnel was one, and I want to point in those first two, they honored the obligations that they agreed to. They didn't come back to the state and ask for more money. On the downtown Midtown Tunnel, as you all know, that project had up front a buy down of a tolling before the facility was actually provided. And the public outcry was such that we had to put in an additional $300 million to buy those tolls down, which in effect reduced the committed equity somewhere from $272 million down to $33 million of the private equity. They didn't offer to renegotiate their contract when we went through there. Now, so they didn't have to, but they didn't offer to in that regard. Route 460, this is the one that was mentioned during the press conference, was actually, the governor said it was a P3. It started out as a P3, but it changed to a design build. There was no public money, private monies or risk at all taking in that project. This was not a project, a problem with a P3 or a concession. This was a problem with a contract. And in September of 2013, the state knew at that time it was not going to get a permit for that project. Although the contract had been let in early January or December 2012, actually, and $30 million a month were being paid for the contractor over and above what was needed to get the permit. It was things being done it could not perform. And in September 2013, the state knew, in fact, it entered into an agreement that revoked the record of decision and the least environmental damaging alternative, the LEPTA, in that. It knew it could not get past the permit, yet the state continued to pay $30 million a month until we came into office in January, and immediately we stopped it. Under the McAuliffe administration, not one nickel was paid to the third parties for the contract. And as the governor mentioned today, we were able to negotiate with them and receive $46 million back, and they gave up $103 million of obligations. Quite frankly, that was the only team that didn't hold us to the contract terms. They could have collected those monies, yet they did not. I'm not saying it was a good result for the state, but I am saying that the contractor negotiated in good faith and could have received additional monies. Yes.
Okay, so in the 460, as I understand, I know there's a lot of history, perhaps a lot of issues, but one of them was this permitting issue. So in the 66 corridor, is there going to be, I mean, that's already a corridor. Does that require permitting?
Two major differences there. From a contractual basis, part of 1886 is, part of that legislation requires that the commissioner cannot pay for monies for a contingency or a risk until it has been solved. Obviously, environmental is a big risk, so there's no monies in that contract that can be paid other than to get the permit. Now, by the way, it's not transferring permit risk. It's doing the work to apply for the permit. You can't transfer permit risk. The only person who get a permit is the state. We own the road. That was the same in 462. I'm not sure we understood. I shouldn't say we. The state understood that, but that was the case. Now, the other thing we know here, and the concessionaire knows here, we are much further along. In fact, in the 460 case, the Army Corps of Engineers never said they were going to issue a permit. In fact, quite the opposite. In this case, the Army Corps said, we believe that the current project is the least environmental damaging. So, big differences in contract, big differences on where we were at the Corps. By the way, just so you know, to the credit of the Commissioner, we have changed our process in doing this now. We now work concurrently with FHWA and the Corps of Engineers when we design the project, working together. And that is how we finally have achieved a permit on Route 460. I said we're going to build the road, but we've achieved the permit. So that's how we've mitigated those risks, both contractually and by legislation. We must do so. plus the Corps has said they believe this is the one that they can do. On the express lanes, 95, this is one that's done well, where the public financing was done up front, along with the private equity. And of course, then you compare that to Transform 66. Now, I want to point out this future liability line. In the Pocahontas Parkway, the reason there's none is because it was handed back over. There are no continuing liabilities. On 495 express lanes, we still have a future liability for HOV usage if it reaches a certain point. On the Midtown Tunnel, we have as much as a $700 million liability if we build an alternative facility down there that takes revenue and traffic off of that tunnel. On Route 460, there's no continuing liabilities. We've already paid for them. But on the 95 express lanes, we continue to have HOV usage. If it reaches over, I believe, 35%, we have to pay 70% of that cost. And if we upgrade Route 1 and it damages their traffic, we have a compensation event. I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just saying we have future liabilities. In Transform 66, we have no future liabilities. HOV is not restricted. There are no alternative facilities. We can't build another express lane on 66, but we couldn't do that anyway. But if you wanted to build Route 1 up or Route 7 or anything, that is not prohibited. The only other thing that we said is they couldn't extend the Orange Line for 10 years. God bless them if they get it done in 10 years, the Orange Line, based on what Metro's doing. I don't mean to be flippant. The bottom line is there are no potential future liabilities. And I think that, again, is negotiating from our current term sheet. Now, in the press conference, one of the reporters asked, what about the debt? Actually, the debt in 460 was non-recourse. The state chose to pay it back because it had no private partner. It didn't want to have the stigma of having a deal done where a bondholder lost money. It chose to do that. It did not have to. It chose to do that. Under Transform 66, it's not even connected with the state. It's a separate entity. The state is not involved at all. It has no equity up. It has nothing in that. There is a non-recourse to the Commonwealth of Virginia.
And so, Mr. Secretary, what happens if they're wrong in their projections and they're unable to make their debt payments under this contract?
So if you look at the financial projections, the same level of debt that we would have put on it is on there. The same tolling would be in place. What they would lose is their equity plus the $500 million they've given the state. But the state would have performance bonds if they defaulted during construction to complete the construction. The state would have the debt in place. It would have in place any necessary to continue the road, and it would have $500 million of upfront money to continue moving forward. So, again, it gets back to a P3 is not anything but a procurement. It's the structure of the deal in the P3. I'll go back to 460. It had nothing to do with it being a P3. It had everything to be doing with a non-understanding or assessment or eliminating the risk with the permit before putting a bunch of money out the door. So that is, again, what the governor said, and I think that's why it's important to document these processes in there, because if you're just negotiating without a baseline, one of you guys said it, these guys got some of the highest paid attorneys. They're multinationals around the world. You know, I don't think it's an even playing field. And I think you can look at this. I'm not saying that we didn't benefit. I'm saying that there's a better way to do it than that. And then if you look again with the comparison of the past P3 deals on the Pocahontas Parkway, we had no competition. No major business terms established at the outset. It probably wasn't a pressing transportation need because the developments never happened. We didn't have to determine the public cost because it was already existing facility on that. 95 express lanes, we didn't have competition. The major business terms weren't established. It was a pressing transportation need. but we never determined what we would do to pay for it if we did it ourselves. I'm not making a judgment, a pejorative. I'm just pointing out to you the correct characteristics of the deal. The downtown Midtown tunnel, we didn't have competition. We didn't have the major business terminus at the outset. We didn't come and say we negotiated from. It was a pressing transportation need. We never determined the public cost to deliver it, to negotiate from. On Route 460, we did have competition at first, and the P3 public-private party said, no way this deal works. And so we then did it ourselves, didn't change the procurement, became a design build, didn't establish the major business terms, certainly wasn't a pressing transportation need, and of course, we didn't have to determine the public cost to deliver because it never happened. 95 express lanes, we sort of had competition up front. We had a competition, but when we actually negotiated the contract, we didn't have competition. We didn't have this public option all the way through. The major business terms were not established up front. We didn't say what we wanted. As a matter of fact, you all recall the 95 express lanes were supposed to be the 95 BRT express lanes. We never got the BRT. I'm not blaming our private partner. I'm saying we never defined what we wanted up front and said what we needed. It is a pressing transportation need. It's a great project. We never determined the public cost to deliver it. On Transform 66, I can say in all of those we did that, and I believe that helped us achieve the result we have today. Now, there are some other benefits besides this procurement. The governor mentioned these. $300 million now will be returned to the High Priority Project Program and Smart Scale for statewide competition. Remember, our $600 million was going to be $300 million up front, from us, and $300 million from Northern Virginia Transportation Authority. So our Smart Scale, the rest of the state will benefit because now we have $1 billion to allocate, almost a 50% increase from where we were. We now have an additional $500 million in improvements in the I-66 corridor, subject to code requirements. They've got to be used up there. $500 million that yesterday we didn't have. And to Mr. Noe's delight, there's $300 million that Northern Virginia Transportation Authority can now use for other key regional projects. In that regard. So I believe this project not only brought benefits to the corridor, but for the entire Commonwealth of Virginia. So I'll wrap this up by saying why I think we were successful. The governor made it clear he would rather have no project than a bad deal. And I cannot overemphasize the ability for us to negotiate from that position. The governor wasn't standing up saying, I got to have this project, I want it done before I leave office. He was saying, I want a good deal or I'm not going to do it, or we'll do it ourselves. And that is key to delivering these projects. The second key is keeping the public option on the table. The private parties should not just compete against themselves, they should compete against us. The law was written to enhance public dollars, not a default private procurement. So if they can beat our deal, and they showed us they certainly could, I think today we solidified that P3s are going to be here for a long term in Virginia. They certainly said they could. I can stand up here and say they enhanced our position. They didn't substitute, they enhanced it. We established competitive process to leverage better deals from the private sector. We can set up here and draw all the analysis we want. And we can say, you know, that makes sense. That's a good deal. But we can't, without competition, say what motivates a particular buyer or a concessionaire. What motivates them to maintain a competitive market advantage? What makes them to enter a market, motivates them to enter a market they're not in? We don't know if they've got a capital transaction they need to reinvest, or they got to pay a bunch of taxes. We don't know if they've got negative interest rates they're trying to move money into because they can't get the returns in their base currency. You know none of that unless you have competitive pressures all the way through. And quite frankly, from the standpoint of what this does, I don't care how much they make after that. I hope they make gazillion dollars, because I know they have done it cheaper for the state than we could do it ourselves. And I always said, I'm not counting their money, I'm just counting the taxpayers' money. And you can't do that without competitive pressure all the way through the process. And then another point is, in our ability to negotiate, we set the detailed business terms right out front. We put them on the computer. Our term sheet was our contract. So I didn't have to worry about if they had $2,000 an hour attorneys. I just kept saying no, because we knew that's what we wanted to negotiate from. And I will tell you, they didn't ask us to say no. They came up with some pretty cool ideas that enhances it for both parties. And I think this makes us a better partner for the next 50 years. Over a 50-year term, there's going to be a time when we're going to need to adjust this contract. Autonomous vehicles are going to come in. What's that going to do to the revenue stream? Nobody contemplated that. We need to sit down and figure that out. But as equal partners, that's the way you do it. That's how you become partners. And that's why I say, I believe these, from the very beginning, there's no proprietary. The only proprietary information in these deals are the algorithm they use that we get to audit, how they determine the traffic, and what they bid. A toll's not proprietary. I mean, how they, so that's why we can put this all out front and say, here's what we're building, guys. If you can beat it, please join us. And they proved to us they could beat it. Now I want to say one more thing, and then I'm going to wrap up by firmly stating to you our position on this project and mine as secretary. And that is, we're going to get the question, well, gosh, if this $500 million, does that mean that if we didn't take it, the tolls could be less? And the answer is no, because this is dynamic pricing. The tolls are based on a flow of traffic. Whether or not it guarantees, I believe in this case, is it 45 or 55? Nick, I can't remember. 55 miles per hour in that quarter, and the tolls are based on that. So if we don't take this money, all we're doing is giving it back to the private sector. So whether we did this toll ourselves, whether either one of these teams did it, the tolls would be the same. I want to make sure that people understand in that, because I know I've already got that question. So, Mr. Chairman, with that, I can affirmatively state to this committee that as Secretary of Transportation, I know the Commissioner is going to do this, but I can stand up here and certify that what we said we were going to do, we delivered. And I'll put that in writing for this contract when we get to the commercial close over the next couple of, about a month, because Nick says I'm pushing everybody, a month or so in that. Because we didn't deviate from the business terms that we told you up front. So with that, Mr. Chairman, that concludes it. I'll be happy to answer any questions if there are any more from the panel.
Well, thank you, Mr. Secretary. Any questions from the panel?
I have, Mr. Vaughn? Yeah, mine is maybe more of a process. Aubrey, you might recall, I don't think you were present, or perhaps you were watching by a video, and I think William Franklin, who also sits on CTV, but also sits on...
I hope he's listening, by the way.
I think both of us sort of had, and maybe Betsy as well, we all sort of had this chicken or egg issue going on at the time of making a determination. Yep. And all we sort of knew was maybe what the public, what we could do it for, or at least a rough idea, but nothing to measure against whether or not it was in the public interest to go forward. It wasn't until really the RFQs went out that through a non-disclosure that we signed that you could share a little more detail, and I know that that was just to get them into the door, but we at least saw what people were willing to, the parameters they were willing to play in relative to the public option. So I guess, I don't know if it's a question, just a comment, whether or not as we go forward on any others, I know P3s can come about differently. We could get it unsolicited, in which then you all would develop the public option, and then we could compare that. But in the case here, where if we have a road and we say, hey, we'd like to see what private partners are out there, and you all develop it, for us to make that determination, I'd like to, ask that you all put a little gray matter into how we could tweak it so that we won't be in that chicken or egg issues.
Yeah, there's a couple of issues we would probably propose that we tighten up. One is that one where we come to you after you've had a little more information. The other one is to actually codify this public option. And getting the Secretary, I should mention again, Rick Brown again, getting the Secretary of Finance to go along with that and say, yes, this is a viable option for the Commonwealth. So be more than willing, I think you'll see us working with the legislatures this year to tighten that up.
Thank you.
Yeah, I had a quick question. What happens between now and the commercial close?
Obviously the documentation, and Mr. Kilpatrick will get a little bit more into this, and Mr. Lawson knows, there are things called alternative technical concepts and some other, well, actually, they'll come after the commercial close, but it's really documenting, making sure all the documentation is together, getting the teams in the contract form, the attorneys, the whole bit. It's more, I won't say it's perfunctory, but it is getting that documentation together.
And Ms. Daly, I would just add to your question, the final RFP did contain an entire draft comprehensive agreement with minimum requirements that each team both met that would have been satisfactory to the Commonwealth. Under the technical scoring, both teams were able to proffer basically providing higher levels of service that exceeded the Commonwealth's minimum requirements. And so what we're going to be doing, well, not me, what the lawyers will be doing.
The lawyers are working on this, yeah.
Is taking the things the winning team proffered that exceeded our requirement and writing contractual language that would ensure they are held to those standards. So, for example, one of the things the Secretary's mentioned is we've asked both teams for their operations manual. We are going to codify those operations manuals into the contract so that we have specific requirements for customer service and other things where these teams can be held accountable, which we don't have in some of our existing P3 deals.
So that'll happen sometime, we hope, by December 8th. I think that's right, in Charlie, December 8th. CTB will get major term update. And then from then through next spring or early summer, depending on what it takes to financial close, that's when there were a lot of concepts offered by these teams that could actually enhance additional monies to the state, or in that regard, will be contemplated and negotiated by Charlie and his team in determining if that's in the best interest to go. So there's a chance there could be some additional monies coming forward based on those negotiations.
And the non-winning team has an opportunity to see what the winning team components of the offer.
Well, they've seen it because it'll be in the contract. It's out in there. The only thing we haven't disclosed is the team that didn't win's offer.
Okay.
But that will be online. That'll be the MOU. All that stuff will be online when it's done. So they've actually been able to see that. The winning team doesn't know what the other team offered, but the other team knows what the winning team did. And so the major risk between commercial and financial close is interest rate risk, and that would be some things that are considered, and we've contemplated in that in what we've disclosed to you today.
Any other questions for the Secretary?
Okay, well, Mr. Chairman, thank you for having me here, and I look forward to working with this board on other projects, and I really appreciate the time you've taken. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Commissioner Kilpatrick, you're up. And for folks who are in the audience, I would just note both these presentations have been posted on transform66.org, I believe it is. I see folks taking some pictures with your camera phones. You'll get much better quality if you just log onto the website. Both of these are on there, along with the initial finding of public interest, and then later today or sometime in the next few days, the Commissioner's certification of the finding of public interest, as well as the Secretary's, will also be available on that website. I should have noted that at the outset to save you a little memory on your phones.
All right. Well, good afternoon. Before I get started with my presentation, this process was exhaustive in terms of the manpower and the effort that went into it from a pretty large team of folks from VDOT, from Department of Rail and Public Transportation, and our consultant team working on the project, working with the concession teams. But all the while, we were still working and still are working through the final environmental document that's a part of this process. So significant outreach to the community, to elected officials. And before I start, I'm not going to call out names because I'm going to miss some, but I'm just going to ask all the folks that are here from the project team to stand up so that you can see just a small portion of the team that's been working on this. So the fun has just started for them. They really have a lot of work to do getting us between now and commercial close, and then from commercial to financial, and then there's this small project that we're going to go out there and build. So we've got a lot of work to do, and we have a fantastic team doing that. So I'm going to walk through, and I'm going to try not to repeat some of the things that the Secretary has already brought up in the discussions in his presentation. So I'll go pretty rapidly through this presentation. So first of all, I want to talk about the path to how we've moved through this process. The environmental document was initiated in 2011, and it was a two-tiered process. And what that means is you do this high-level corridor selection, and then the more detailed level environmental document, which we are wrapping up as we speak. And again, that began in 2011. The initial record of decision in 2013, and then we began the process in August where I made my initial finding of public interest, and you all are aware of that. The Commonwealth Transportation Board in September of 2015, just a little over a year ago, authorized us to proceed with a procurement and a request for qualifications. We got 13 different combinations of proposals, and you all are aware of those. But from that, we shortlisted the proposals and move forward with what we call a DBFOM, Design, Build, Finance, Operate, Maintain, also known as a Revenue Risk Concession Model. And so that's what these teams have been moving forward. And then again, after that in December, I briefed this group for the first time. It was the first meeting, I believe, of this advisory committee under the legislation. Some of the key policy considerations: funding for transit, having the concessionaire retain the risk for excessive HOV use. In other words, if there's more HOV riders than was expected, that's the risk of the concessionaire, not of the Commonwealth. The 95 project and the 495 project have protections for the concessionaire for high HOV use. This project does not. There's very limited relief for alternate facilities. We effectively have used alternative technical concepts, and I'll talk a little bit later about why this is such a big thing. Minimizing the negative impacts during construction. There are liquidated damages built into these proposals. There are some early opening provisions to open certain assets of the project early, including some commuter ride facilities and some improvements at the 2866 interchange, which is a key point along this project. And not the notice to proceed, but not issuing the notice to proceed until confirmation and assurance that the necessary permits can be obtained. And as you'd mentioned, this project is different in that it is not a greenfield project. The total wetland impacts are significantly less. But even so, our team worked throughout the environmental process with the Army Corps of Engineers and those other agencies to ensure that the project that we're bringing forward is one that is permittable. That's so important to the success of this project.
And I just want to note that is a major change in this contract compared to, Mr. Vaughn, the 460 project you referenced. In that one, there was mobilization and other construction work that was able to move forward before that permit was issued. That is not going to take place in this project.
Absolutely. Some of the other key terms, it's a concession of 50 years, and that has not changed. The developer is going to finance the project. Again, it's non-recourse debt that the concessionaire would raise. That we were willing to provide up to a $600 million public contribution towards the delivery of this project. We've talked a little bit about the permits. The design and construction, it's a fixed price contract. The operations and maintenance are the responsibility of the concession team, the developer. We continue to be responsible for the general purpose lanes, but not for the express lanes.
And I would just note for those of you who are in the audience, those business terms should be extremely familiar because they're the exact same terms that were published by the commissioner over a year ago. They have not changed.
In terms of, and the Secretary already spoke to this, House Bill 1886, the Governor's P3 Reform Bill, and this just, again, this slide reinforces the meat of that bill and the things that were required. And one of them fundamentally is this finding of public interest, which is required by me and be affirmed by the Secretary. And then at the end of the process, prior to entering into a comprehensive agreement, I must reaffirm my finding of public interest, and then the Secretary would concur. I have signed I have reaffirmed my finding of public interest, and I have signed that document. The Secretary then, prior to entering into the comprehensive agreement, it's necessary for him to concur with my decision. And that is a fundamental change. And again, it's part of House Bill 1886. So how are we meeting? I mentioned the finding of public interest that that I made early on, and the Secretary, again, concurred with that. And then we began the development of the project. And again, I'm not going through these bullets because the Secretary has already spoken of them. As we go through, this committee is a result of House Bill 1886. There are other components about minimizing compensation events, and the term sheet that we put out is those terms are in the contract, the draft comprehensive agreement, which we will execute in December. Those have not changed. In terms of compensatory events, competing facilities in the world of these types of projects is a prime concern, and the widening of or the improvements of alternate roadways we are not restricted from doing. There are restrictions on 66 on widening 66, but not on alternate facilities. And again, the other provision for the Orange Line is that the Orange Line could be a compensation event if it was extended within the next 10 years. And again, with the challenges of Metro, it's highly unlikely that that Metro will be in any position to extend the Orange Line in the next 10 years. And then again, finally, the affirming of the finding of public interest, the Secretary did that initially in 2015, and will need to do that prior to signing of the comprehensive agreement this fall. So the toll concession that is sought, the request for the three options was back in September. You saw the charts, and you know that process that we went through. But based on what we saw, we believe that a concession model was the appropriate model to proceed with. And that final request for proposals was issued in 2016, and I'll reinforce again, the terms that we had from the beginning are the same terms that we put in the final request for proposals. The public option is going to remain on the table, and there was a Senate bill language that allowed for that. In the event that we were unable to, teams were unable to meet our terms, or that for whatever reason the proposals that came in were not in the best interest of the Commonwealth. I'm pleased to say that the proposals we got, as the Secretary said, were both compliant bids, and we're very pleased with the proposals we received and the proposal of the successful team. So some procurement milestones. Again, the draft of the RFP, the request for proposals, went out last December. The final was issued in July, and so you're very familiar with where we are today. We've received those two proposals. I have affirmed the finding of public interest. We've announced the preferred bidder, the Governor did, and we're here today with the PPTA Advisory Committee meeting. And again, that was something that, while not required by code, it was a commitment that the Secretary and the administration had made to come back to this committee once we had received the bids to brief this committee on where we were, and again to affirm or reaffirm that we were continuing to follow the term sheet and the finding of public interest was still valid. So the preferred proposal, best value proposal, and as the Secretary mentioned, it was a combination of technical score and lowest public contribution to the project, and the successful bidder, Express Mobility Partners, had the highest technical score, and with the concession payment of at least $500 million, excuse me, was clearly the top scoring in the area of financing. So again, two competitive and compliant proposals, but Express Mobility Partners was the successful bidder. So again, the team is made up of Central Global, Meridian Infrastructure North America, and they're investing over 40% of the project funding, and that's important. 40% is equity towards this project. So that is significant. It's about a $2.3 billion construction project. I can tell you that in looking at the two teams and looking at our own estimates, they fall very much in line with what we would have expected, whether it had been built as a design-build by the Commonwealth or under this model. So the design-build cost, that construction cost, was very consistent. This provides for the required transit payments. It was a requirement of the term sheet. And as you've seen and have heard now, and I'll say it one more time, there will be a concession payment at financial close of at least $500 million. There are interest rate risks and so on, but those have been contemplated in their proposals, and they've been contemplated in our process, and there is some protection there.
May I ask, Mr. Vaughn? Yeah, Mr. Commissioner, just, and I think the Secretary sort of touched on this wherever he went, but anyways, so on the financing piece, as I understand it, then he had alluded to, I think, some rating agencies had provided some type of rating on each of the bidders. Is that, did I get that correct? Or?
You did, and I'm going to answer a little bit of it, and I'm going to get way out of my swim lane, and that's why I have my CFO sitting up here. One of the requirements of this package in the submission was to get at least two ratings from rating agencies, investment grade ratings of their model, of their traffic and revenue model. And so both teams provided that, and I'm going to get them wrong which two were Express Mobility Partners, but both those confirmed that they were comfortable with the investment grade traffic and revenue study. Did I get that right, John?
That's right.
Okay. See, he trains me well, and that's about all I can tell on the finance. But again, I think this is important that it wasn't just, hey, look what we can do. We went to the rating agencies early on and have them look at our traffic and revenue, and they do the same thing. And that gives much greater comfort in these proposals. These rating agencies, you know, some of these deals that were done back in the early days of PPTAs in the mid-2000s and even earlier, the sophistication of those models and the rating agencies maybe wasn't there. But we collectively, and those rating agencies especially, have learned a lot over the years as they go through these deals. So they know what they're looking for and the kind of the touch points and the concerns that they might have with the traffic and revenue model. So again, both teams provided those indicative ratings from the rating agencies. John.
And then, Mr. Commissioner, if I could just add to that, as part of their proposals, they also have documentations from the technical advisors, both for the lenders and an equity perspective as well. So there's really 4 looks at their traffic and revenue.
So the last bullet here, I think, is so important. And we today, on our design bill, because of legislation this past session, can do this now. But before that, alternative technical concepts were really only a part of the P3 world. And on this particular project, we saw from both teams some tremendous ideas. We've got some terrific engineers that are working for VDOT and working for our team, but it's also good to have people that come at it from a different viewpoint, have maybe different experiences around the world in terms of construction techniques and in terms of operations and maintenance and how you would build one of these projects. So one of the great things about this process is we were able to evaluate during the process alternative technical concepts and tell them, yes, you can put that one in your proposal, or that one we're not going to accept. And so as they put their proposals together, they were able, each team, their ideas, they were able to build that into their proposal. And because we pay a stipend in this process, we are able to take those technical concepts from both teams, and we will then take with the preferred team, after commercial close, we can then come to them and say, hey, we've got these things here, let's look at these, and some of these we may take and some of them we may not. Some will add is a cost savings, and some may be just a better, maybe a better value, and some may be, frankly, a better product. So that's the great thing about this alternative technical concept process. We are, what we've seen on this project really reinforces why it was important to us to get the legislation passed for our design build program, because we think there's some great value in this area. So next steps, we will brief the Commonwealth Transportation Board on the commercial terms of the project and the contract at the December meeting. We expect to go to financial close by December 15th. My target date is December 8th, which will be the day after the Commonwealth Transportation Board meeting, and then go to financial close by early summer of 2017. There'll be a lot of work that goes on between December and July as they work on their financing, the TIFIA office and their other financing. But we'll also be working on those alternative technical concepts. They'll be working on their permit. They'll be working on their design, early design work as we go through the next 6-7 months. Again, some major milestones. They'll begin final design in January. We'll have public hearings in the fall. We expect to begin to break ground on this project by the end of 2017, and including some right-of-way acquisition. There is limited right-of-way acquisition on this project because it largely falls within the existing 66 right-of-way and footprint, but there will be some acquisitions during the process. Some milestones, and I mentioned this earlier, that the park and ride lot at Gainesville, they must have 900 spaces available by 2019. That they must be able to remove the 4 traffic signals at the 28 interchange by February of 2020. And what that really means is that grade separation will be in place at 28. We don't just let people pull up stoplights and not do something else. So this is really accelerating. This is a critical piece of the 66 corridor, and it will actually be done a bit early. We anticipate tolling to begin in the summer of 2022, and the full project completion a month later. So again, that gives you a sense of the project and the schedule going forward. So with that, I'd be glad to answer any questions about my presentation of the project.
Thank you, Commissioner. Any questions from the panel? Mr. Kaspowitz?
Mr. Commissioner, how will the cost savings from ATCs be shared between the contractor, the concessionaire, and the Commonwealth?
Very simply, each one of those would be negotiated. The ATCs that they have proposed are already built into their proposal. So the only ATCs that would be negotiated are from the other team. Or frankly, there may be some idea that as we move through this process, one of the other team comes up with an idea that is improves the project, and then each one of those is negotiated between us and the concession team.
And I want to be clear, the only things that are negotiated after commercial close are going to be those ATC types of concepts, and that really just deals with the cost, and the design build cost of the project. We will have an executed contract that is the comprehensive agreement that's previously been published. And so that's really going to be a discussion. And as the Commissioner said, some of these cost more, but might actually provide a better end product, and then you might have some that actually reduce cost, that if you can combine them can be a net no change for the project, but deliver a better outcome. Any other questions? Well, Commissioner, thank you very much, and I'd like
Thank you.
thank committee members for making themselves available, and that ends today's meeting.